Right, hello everybody and welcome to this webinar. My name is Claire Collins and I head up NGA's consultancy service, and this is the third in our series of webinars which we have introduced to support governing boards during these challenging times. Because of the COVID lockdown, I'm presenting this from my study at home, and I'm hoping that there won't be any distracting background effects such as barking dogs, ringing doorbells, or like with the last webinar which Simon did from the Isle of Wight, wailing seagulls in the background. The webinar is designed to last about 30 minutes, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time allowed at the end to answer any questions that may have come up during the session. So if you do have a question, please use the question box, which is just normally on the right hand side of your screen in that side panel. Just click on that and leave a question, and hopefully that will I'll be able to pick that up at the end. Right, so just to get started, the aim of this webinar is to introduce the issue of board dynamics, which when times are normal can be a tricky issue for governing boards. And when circumstances are new and challenging, like they are now, can result in strained relationships and sometimes regrettably a loss of trust. So we're going to look at the nature of board dynamics, expectations of those governing, how to establish relationships, and if things go wrong, how to address the issues. By doing so, you should then have an understanding of the importance of good relationships between all those involved with governing and why trust matters with that, and some strategies that can be put into place to establish a healthy dynamic that reduces the risk of any trust of trust being broken, basically. And throughout this webinar, we're going to hold two polls so that we can get an idea of how this issue might affect you. So just to get going, I want to start by looking at understanding board dynamics. And I think it's fair to say that we have all have an idea of what the perfect board would look like. And yes, it is that board which is knowledgeable about governing schools and trusts, and all board members and executive leaders for that matter are well trained. Everybody turns up on time, may even have time enough for a sociable coffee with the team prior to the meeting beginning, and they attend regularly, of course. All are prepared for the meeting or event. They've read all the papers, they've done a bit of research into the issues that they want to know more about, they've carried out their monitoring visits, and they've even thought about questions they want to ask and how they're going to ask these, so the carefully worded challenges is delivered where required, and constructive support possible. And what's more, no one is what we call a single issue board member. In other words, they only focus on one issue, maybe special needs or what their own child is up to. And that should, of course, result in the perfect board, which is a vibrant, proactive, respectful board with a positive dynamic, always focusing on its core purpose and core functions, supporting and challenging in equal measure. Okay. So moving on to with this topic, I want to ask a question, which is, what sort of board are you? Some of you will have seen this graphic before, and it shows four typical board dynamics and has plotted them into quadrants according to the degree of support and challenge that the board offers. So in the top left, we have the fan club, the board which is always there to support the senior leader. This is the board which genuinely supports to the extent that they actually fail to spot risks, and they don't actually find themselves that they're not aware of those weaknesses that might emerge. There's also then the applicators, bottom left. These are the ones who leave it to professionals. This is the board that is lacking in curiosity, abandons its role in robust scrutiny, and results in a failure to hold the senior leader to account for what is going on in their school or trust. Then we've got bottom right, the adversaries, who keep a close eye on everything. This is the board lacking in trust in the professionalism in the school of trust, and it can be very negative and ignore the positives, unsupportive, that sort of board. And of course, in the top right hand corner, we have the supportive challengers, those who are want to know the good, the bad. They understand the value of looking for reasons without blame. They'll consider innovation without recriminations, and will work with the leadership to drive the school forward. And that's the board that if Ofsted does come visiting, then there will be no surprises. Right, I want to use this as a lead into our first poll, and I just have to. This is some of us are a bit new to running polls, and I want to therefore ask you to fill in here which of these 4 categories best describes your board. And I'd like you to answer honestly. So are you the fan club? Are you the abdicators? Tick the box. Are you the adversaries? And are you the supportive challengers? So I'm watching, you can't see what I can see, which is everybody filling in or ticking their boxes. And it's absolutely fascinating to see the numbers go up. We've got probably about 3/4 of you have voted already. And I'm going to shut this shortly because we've got just a few more who might like to take this opportunity to fill in their poll. Okay, we're nearly there. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll now, and absolutely, as expected, the vast majority, 75, nearly 80%, would say that they're supportive challengers. Interestingly enough, about 15% are saying that they're the fan club, with between 5 and 7% putting themselves in the adversaries or the abdicators category. So let me move us on then to our next slide, which, as I say, it does indicate that as we would expect from people who are NGA members and who have registered for a webinar like this, you're all doing, the vast majority of you doing a very good job and are doing that supportive challenge role well. But there are times when boards might find their approach tends towards one of the other behaviours that we have been talking about. And the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment due to the COVID-19 lockdown may be exactly one of those times when boards find that their dynamic is shifting. And this is understandable because I don't think that anyone would disagree that the times that we're working in, to use what is a very overworked word, the unprecedented times, there's enormous pressure on schools. And it's to the great credit of our community that we have not come across a governor or trustee that has disputed the fact that our heads and chief execs are having to manage their schools in a completely different way, making difficult decisions as well as coping with their own and others' anxiety. And it's because of this that we may wish to slip into fan club or abdicator mode. But while being highly supportive is a great intention, being over supportive can get in the way of leaders being able to get on with their jobs. And an example would be governors or trustees offering to volunteer when in reality, actually managing those volunteers can present more pressure than it relieves. Added to that is that actually governing has to continue and there will be board business that has to be carried out. And so the challenge to boards is managing this so that critical decisions get made with the minimal pressure and fuss, thus reducing the risk of strained relationships and skewed board dynamics. And what's more, we're having to do this remotely. Inevitably, the lockdown response to the pandemic and the closure of schools has forced upon us different ways of working and communicating. And coping with this in itself can add stress to what is already an incredibly stressful situation, for which, let's face it, there have been absolutely no rehearsals. I think that all of us are discovering that leading in a virtual world is not impossible, but it does require extra effort to remain connected with others in meaningful ways. And that in order to do that, we want to do that because it means we will sustain relationships with colleagues, keeps things moving forward. And if you've got time, it's worth reading an article by Professor Alma Harris on the issue of leading a school during lockdown, which you can find on the Chartered College of Teaching website. But what is actually quite wonderful is that having been pushed into this virtual world and becoming familiar with video conferencing, many boards have adapted brilliantly to remote working, so much so that this pandemic may prove to be a game changer for boards, especially for those who have very busy governors and trustees. And I think it's fair to say that we are all discovering that meetings are more meaningful if you can see colleagues on screen. In other words, yes, video does indeed trump audio. But as an aside of anticipating that in future there may be much more work happening remotely, as these changes to established methods of interacting with colleagues, especially coupled with other pressures, can lead to untypical behaviours and therefore stress and strained relationships. So as we all grapple with the wonders and limitations of Zoom and Skype and Teams or Hangouts or whatever platform you're choosing to use, we are also having to discover what we like or don't like about this way of communicating. And so it's not to say that basically there won't be pitfalls, which may result in confused messages, frustration, resentment, feelings of being left out, failure to make the decisions that still need to be made and made by the people who should be making them. And it is only by being aware of these that we can prevent our established board dynamic being threatened. So, for example, many of you will be aware that NGA promotes board diversity with our Everyone on Board campaign, which has focused mainly on getting more young people and more people from the Black and ethnic minority communities around the table. But actually in these times we need to be aware of our governors and trustees who haven't been brought up in an online world and who will be less able to adjust to remote working, both because they don't have the kit or they don't know how to use it, but also because they are less comfortable with the very concept of video streaming. And I was wondering if I was making too much of this point, because I mean, my parents are 88, they're able to Zoom, so is it? But actually there was a long thread on Facebook, one of the Facebook governance groups last night, about this very point. So in order to keep our boards inclusive and stop resentments building up, we must put everyone at their ease, if necessary, taking the time to talk through with those who are less confident how to download a platform, how to join a remote meeting, and just build their confidence so that they're more able to continue to partake in board business. Those of us with busy family lives who are likely to be acutely aware of how children have a tendency to interrupt at vital moments. So I'm sure many of you will remember Professor Robert Kelly being interviewed live on BBC News when his kids decided to come in and see what Daddy was up to. I mean, he handled it with great aplomb. But in order to prevent colleagues self-excluding because they're frightened that this might happen, we must acknowledge that those things can happen and give reassurance that we're a tolerant board and maybe even have a good sense of humour. Then, of course, there is that temptation to make judgments about people, and would seeing your chief exec in their Arsenal shirt or colleagues in their gardening clothes change your view of them? Would seeing what the camera reveals about your home surroundings cause you embarrassment? There's been some online comments about people's bookshelves, and some of you might have seen, if you're Twitter users, that in fact I think the winner was Simon Sharma. This is his part of his study, which made me smile anyway. And then, of course, we've got the issue of body language. And actually, just because you're on camera doesn't mean that your body language isn't being picked up. And that if you roll your eyes and you sigh, microphones are incredibly good these days, and they're going to pick it all up. And just yesterday, somebody said that Claire's bored with this meeting. I can tell from the look in her eyes, and that was me, because I stopped thinking about how the camera was working and that I had actually zoned out. So, and I suppose the only other thing to say is that if you're carrying on some sort of conversation on your messaging on your phone at the same time or emailing on the side, do be careful. It's very easy to missend things which can end up upsetting people dreadfully when you don't mean to. So, being aware of those pitfalls is obviously critical. I think it's actually quite a good opportunity, though, to remind ourselves of what the expectations are for those governing in terms of their behaviour and relationships. And starting at the very top, so to speak, obviously there's the, well, I hope it's obvious that everyone's aware that as a governor or a trustee, we're a holder of public office, and therefore we must understand and adhere to the principles of public life, often referred to as the Nolan Principles. The education sector has built on these with the framework for ethical leadership, and if you just Google those words, then you'll find out more about how to translate this framework into the life of your school or trust. And we know that some boards actually have allocated agenda time to not just noting that these principles and these ethical issues, but to discussing what they mean for them as a board and how they guide and influence the way that they work. And that might be something you think is useful going forward. But then, of course, we've also got what most of us, I hope, are incredibly familiar with, is the DfE's guidance for those governing, which makes mention of behaviours and relationships. The handbook, the governance handbook, devotes the whole of section 3 to the board's relationship with 3.1, I should say, not the whole of section 3, to the board's relationship with executive leaders. And the competency framework makes clear that boards must be, and these are just words I've picked out from various parts of it, they've got to be collaborative, they've got to be prepared to listen, work in partnership, build strong working relationships. They need to function well as part of a team, that building an effective team is a necessary skill and behaviour for ensuring effective relationships and dynamics around the table. So actually there is a fair amount of, there's indications there about what is expected from us. And then, of course, we've got our own 8 elements of effective governance. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with these, and familiar with also what we say is that if these 8 elements are in place, then the indicators for effective governance are generally very positive. And you can see that good relationships based on trust features there at number 5. But to an extent, it's very easy to say, to list, to say, to point out what is expected. And it can actually be much harder to establish these relationships and to ensure that the dynamic is understood and stays positive, especially when, for example, new people join the board. If you have a new head teacher or chief exec arriving, because sometimes that can shift the alignment. Or at times crisis like the one we're experiencing now. And the next section of this webinar is just going to look at some of the things that we can do to scaffold expectations of how relationships and behaviour should work with boards. So, obviously, I hope it's obvious anyway that the first thing that all boards should establish is that everyone is clear about the purpose of governance. And that this is made, it's also made very clear in the DfE's guidance, but it is helpful to remind ourselves of this from time to time, and that we also have our sort of core functions, if you like, described, and I'm sure that many of you will know these by heart and carry them out diligently. This means that at times like this, we can keep our focus on these functions and not stray beyond our remit, risk upsetting and losing the trust of those we have employed to lead and manage our schools, and who in turn we do not want to mistrust us. Which doesn't mean to say that there won't be any tension, because it's also at times like this we must look at the weight that we assign to each function. So, for example, with the first core function, the summer term is a time when many boards are reviewing their strategic plan, meeting time as allocated to assessing how much progress has been made with achieving the vision, and have we met our targets, that sort of thing. All of that's up in the air at the moment because schools have stopped operating in a way that we recognise, and many targets and KPIs will be absolutely meaningless. However, what we do really well is we generally do very well anyway, is have a set of stated values. Now is very much a time to take a moment to reflect on whether our school or trust is responding to the pandemic in line with our ethos and values, and if not, why not? And that's not to say that it's something we need to act upon now, but it might be something that's worth returning to when some sort of normality returns. With function 2, it's absolutely vitally important that we still get the assurances that we need, that our schools are meeting the highest standards expected of them in terms of complying with especially safeguarding requirements and protecting vulnerable pupils and what staff are up to, in terms of, staff being in, staff not being in, how staff are coping, that sort of thing. And that's all covered in our other guidance. And then, of course, with core function 3, and this is again a time of year when we're thinking about numbers and role budgets. Now it's all being hit with unexpected expenditure, additional unexpected expenditure, and this, how this is going to impact on our financial planning at a time of enormous economic uncertainty for everyone is going to be a challenge for boards. So, in other words, much as we might like to make life easier for everyone, and so to slip into abdicator role or fan club role, even though it might be trickier than usual, focusing on our core functions will help keep relationships on track and the dynamic positive. Regrettably, though, sometimes things do get tricky, and when they do, the first port of call for all of us should be those core documents that most boards now have in place, the role description and the code of conduct. And these are reminding ourselves that in these are the clear expectations of how we operate in our governance roles, and how by doing it in this way that the trust that is needed is promoted. Most codes of conduct, and certainly the NGA Model 1, cover relationships and serve as useful reminders about the professional nature of the roles that we undertake. It's probably worth mentioning here that if the board approves the code, then it applies to all board members, whether or not they personally approve of it. And it's also worth mentioning here that in some schools and trusts, their role description and code of conduct might talk about working electronically, the expectations for that. And it could be that after this, we will need to revisit these documents to clarify, how if we are going to work in this way and what expectations are for it. I think I've mentioned a couple of times already that governors and trustees have been overwhelmingly supportive of their schools and school and trust leaders, but governance does have to carry on and decisions need to be made by the right people. This will involve school leaders no matter what the pressures elsewhere are. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this document, and it can be a useful addendum to the Code of Conduct, especially as it has the endorsement of the professional associations. But hopefully everyone's showing enormous reserves of consideration during this time, and reminders of the extent and limit of roles and responsibilities on both sides won't be needed. So, if there are issues with how your board is functioning, and if issues of trust have arisen and relationships are fragile, reviewing the effectiveness of your board is good practice, and now might be a good time to consider the options. NGA has a suite of online self-evaluations, and if there is unexpected space in your governance calendar, planning how to utilise one of these over the summer might be an opportunity not to be missed. To find the appraisals, go to this is just a screenshot of our website, and just go to the drop-down menu where you've got training and development there. And if you just click on that bottom one, then the details will come up there. And you'll find information about a self-evaluation tool, an electronic one for boards. You'll also find details about the chair's 360 appraisal, which is a very neat and simple way conducting a 360, and both of these all come with guidance and templates to help you get the most from the exercise. Many boards are extending their self-review work to include an annual conversation with board members about their work on the board over the last year or so, and if they have felt as a board member they've made a contribution, if they have any training needs, if there's anything they want to share about what they find frustrating about the role. This is often, we hear from chairs, it's just another thing to do, I've got too much to do. But actually, this is a really good task for the vice chair to undertake. And it's arguable that in challenging times like the ones we're experiencing now, checking in with colleagues towards the end of this term is a great way to build a sense of value within your team. For those of you who might like a template about how the sort of questions you might use in a semi-structured conversation like this, there's one in the Knowledge Centre, and again, I've got a screenshot of our website here, just with an arrow pointing to where it is, and hopefully you'll be able to, well, if you can't find it, get in touch, and we will give you more detailed pointers. Which leads us to our second poll. So I'm just going to get this to be available, and I want this one. I'm going to launch this poll now. The question is, which of the following self-review tools has your board used in the last 3 years? So have you used an online or web-based self-evaluation tool like ones I've just described? Have you used some questions that you just asked yourselves, like our 2021 questions? You might have used another form of review. You might not have done any sort of review. You might have actually not done one because you've had an external review of governance. And I can see that people are voting already, and it's this is really interesting information for us as an organisation, apart from just being able to report back to you. Okay, we're nearly at 75% of people have responded. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay. I'm going to just a bit more time. Yeah, we're nearly up to 70%. I'm going to close that now. The 40% of you have ticked box 2. I asked yourself some evaluation questions, and then there is an equal split, 15% roughly on the other 3. This is really helpful information for us, so thank you very much for your contributions on that. Okay, moving on. Unfortunately, despite everyone's best efforts, sometimes things go wrong, especially when the pressure is on, and relationships can come under stress and tensions rise and the board dynamic is compromised. And in this last section, this last couple of minutes, we're just going to look very quickly at how you can deal with things if it happens. It's probably worth saying that for well-established boards which have been competently led at times of change when the pressure rises, even then things can result in a team of adversaries. And before you say the word coronavirus, trust has been broken, relationships are troubled, and we've got the perfect storm. Very often those sorts of simple misunderstandings can be sorted straight away with a quick conversation along the lines of, have you got a minute? I just want to discuss something with you. And they normally, our default tends to be normally to deal with them face-to-face in a safe space with just a couple of people present. But of course, we can't do that at the moment. Which doesn't mean to say that issues should be ignored. In fact, with new and difficult decisions being made all the time, it's important that we stop wounds festering and recognise problems and bring them out into the open. Inevitably, this sort of load is going to fall generally onto the chair, but in some cases another trustee or governor may be better placed. And actually don't forget your clerk, whose neutrality may enable them to act as a mediator or just to issue reminders about expectations of those governing. And that's especially true at the moment if chairs are overloaded with other work or have overwhelming family responsibilities and worries. Your key resource is likely to be a code of conduct, which should be used to hold governors and trustees to account for their commitment or behaviours. Often a quiet word or reminder will suffice, but especially at times like this, when issues with understanding the extent of everyone's role and responsibilities can emerge. Planning some joint training, which includes both exec leaders and governors and trustees in the future is probably a good thing to think about. And, you know, sadly, things do sometimes go very wrong. We had a call today from a board where things have gone very wrong, and they're exploring mediation, and so probably external review will be required. But that's obviously not for now, but we do need to bear these things in mind. There is guidance. We have a guidance document called Creating the Right Dynamic, and again, there's a screenshot there to show you how you can find it on the website. Please do have a look at that. And as we draw this webinar to a close, perhaps just take time to reflect on actually, you know, most of our boards are doing great jobs. They're professional. They recognise that you mustn't get too close, that you do need to have safeguards in place to prevent coziness, that we do have to be aware of our emotional response to things, especially when we're all feeling particularly emotional, and these are emotional times, but we must be responsible for how we behave. And that we have actually a lot of chairs out there who are leading well and are considerate and assured, and we're very lucky to have that. I think it's also worth reminding ourselves at the end of the day that when in doubt, boards do need to remind themselves that all decisions must be made in the best interests of pupils, even though when, like now, and now is the time of, you know, the overused word, this unprecedented time. Times are tough for staff, and so we can be required to make very skilled judgments, which involve, you know, fine balancing. But that reminder to self is useful. So as we conclude this, I hope that this webinar has been helpful. I'm just having a quick look at some of the questions that have come in. Some of these are comments which are interesting with the different sorts of boards, and somebody said that some boards have governors in all 4 categories. I think we all recognise those, but these comments are useful for us to see. It's also useful to see some of you haven't been able to vote, which is we'll look into that and see if there's anything. Right, thank you everybody for your, let me just I need to get rid of this so that I can move on to our final slide and just use this opportunity to say thank you very much to everybody for registering, for logging on, to wish you well, good governing, and stay safe, and it's goodbye from NGA.